Okay, in part one of Pulse of the Future, I ended on a discussion of metaphors and the role that metaphors play in the images of the future. And so this part two, will focus more on the various images of the future that have exerted a pull, or are exerting a pull in the present time. And you can see how the role that metaphors play in these images. So I'll begin with the modern image of the future as progress, and I will make a case that the image of the future is chiefly modern born, and it is very much related to the idea of progress. And it has played a dominant role throughout the modern era. It has defined the modern era, really. And then, but I'll also talk about other images of the future that from the late 19th century, the 20th century, and in the 21st century, beginning with globalism, which there was two waves, one in the late 19th century, and then the more recent wave in the late 20th century, which is probably more significant, really. But the idea which is largely economic in nature, globalization, economies and cultures fuse as one. And then the discussion will turn to a phenomena in the latter part of the 20th century due to the acceleration of change and its impact on society and consciousness, the collective consciousness, is that of future shock. Where people just can't seem to be able to adapt to change that's happening so rapidly. And this is also related to hyperculture and death of the future. And of course, the media plays a large role and has played a large role in that, especially in the latter part of the 20th century and even today. And so I want to pick up on the idea of media as spectacle. From that point, I'll turn to a plea from the heartland, again related to the acceleration of change. The change is happening too fast, and future shock. We need to back up the future. There's the threat to traditional values. And from that point, then I will also briefly discuss very important work in the 20th century, especially a classic text in future studies, The Limits of Growth. And especially as we now are living in the period that the limits of growth was mostly relating to 50 to 100 years in the future. We're entering that period now, so it's good to look back on that work and see how its significance to the time we live in. And then, of course, and that is also related to the collapse of industrial civilization. We'll be looking at some more darker images, post-apocalyptic, for example, in which the question of humanity's survival is at stake. And even if it does survive, what will the quality of life be? This leads us to the next sort of image of the future, that of the social-Darwinist, one that's really often neglected, I think, in the literature. It's even though it began in the late 19th century, it has played a huge role throughout the 20th century and today. It's mostly related to the idea of survival of the fittest applied to society and capitalism and class consciousness. But then more of a later 20th century and definitely 21st century concept is that of conscious evolution. That now that we understand evolution, we can if we're conscious of it, we can guide it. And so consciousness will play a role now in our own evolution, and also on the other side of the struggle for survival, rather than focusing on the competitive nature, we look at how the cooperative component plays a role in the 21st century. And the concept of the planet as our garden, that related to sustainability, that and the restoration of the earth and achieving the right balance between humanity and their resources and their biosphere, and the health of the planet itself. And the concept of Gaia is or maybe the driving metaphor there. This leads to more or less 21st century consciousness, the Great Awakening, the emergence of the 21st century mind, and the transition, perhaps through descent paths, to a new paradigm that will represent a new image of the future in a new era that's beyond, it's not just postmodern, but beyond postmodern, to something new, in which sustainability will play a great role in the 21st century. Well, anyway, these are the sections of the Pulls of the Future, Part 2, that I will be discussing. So let's begin with the most dominant image of the future that is modern born. It's related to the idea of progress, and based on J.B. Bury's classic text in the 1930s, The Idea of Progress, that it is a modern born phenomena. It is definitely, it is the dominant image of the future in the modern era, is that of progress, and through the advent of science and technology. So we can say, even though I know that there are some futurists who argue that there was, images of the future in the past, in the ancient and medieval times, and people had the innate capacity for foresight. Now, I don't necessarily argue against that, but I think that the difference is that the concept of time was different then. The cyclical notion of time was dominant, and thus, even though there was an image of the future and an idea of progress, but it didn't really play a very dominant role in the society at large. It didn't capture the social imagination the way the idea of progress and the image of the future has in the modern era. So, and as I mentioned, this is chiefly due to the advances in science and technology, and it's a shift from what we call providence to progress, which was more human based, that through our discoveries and through the innovations in technology that we would be able to realize the improvement of humanity overall. That was the promise. And so inherent in this image as well, though, are some other assumptions that we should be fully aware of, that the Earth is seen as, a materialistic, is seen materially as something that exists for the sake of mankind to exploit and to use the resources, for our development in order to progress. We should exploit the resources of the earth, and that all other creatures exist for the sake of man. And so mostly oftentimes looked upon merely as a source of food. And if not a source of food, then something that we will allow to exist as long as they don't get in the way of our progress. But if they do get in the way, well, that's just too bad, because everything exists for the sake of man and his pursuit of happiness in through the advent of science and technology and the Industrial Revolution, and in which inherent in that is the idea of capitalism being the engine of economic growth, and this has especially been true since the capitalism has grown now to world capitalism after the end of the Cold War. So we see that this has been again an expansion of the Western idea of progress that has gone global, and the result is this image of the future is that of the technological society of industrial civilization. And I didn't say enough about also I think it's good to point out the difference that technology has made. That technology is a chief driver of the future, of change, driver of change throughout the modern era, especially since the Industrial Revolution. But it's not that, and this compares again with the previous eras of the ancient and modern time. It's not that technology or markets even didn't exist. They did exist. It just didn't play as much of a role in social development, or they weren't seen as drivers towards progress, back then. It was only in the modern era that technology began to play such a dominant role. And today we live with this, and we have benefited a great deal in this idea. There has been some progress, no doubt about that. At the same time, though, we also are beginning to realize that there is a price to pay, and that there are consequences. Some of those consequences of our technological advancement are not so utopian, but actually can become a dystopia. And so, in fact, we find that a lot in the dystopian literature. So anyway, this is the dominant image. The modern image of the future is progress. I think another pole of the future that's related to the modern image of the future is progress is that of globalism. In other words, the idea of progress is meant to spread to all of humanity, and the global consciousness of one world, one people, and this is. But at the same time, most of what we understand as globalism or globalization has been largely economically based, and it has been enabled through advents in technology, like in the 19th century, through advents in the transportation and communications technology, brought about the first wave of globalization, and then in the more recent wave, which occurred largely around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, then this is more, I think, more profound wave of globalization, and technology played a huge role in that. Again, in the same areas of transportation and communications technology, and the advent of the computer and the digital revolution. The idea of globalism is that, and it's had a great impact on nation states, by the way, where nation states are just seen as sort of obstacles to this image of the future, and so we need to break down the borders, and so that technology and the free flow of capital, again, to world capitalism, can create wealth for all. And this wealth, of course, will trickle down, so to speak. Everyone will benefit from it. That's the idea. To some extent, that has occurred, but again, there are a lot of problems associated with it. Traditional isms and dogmas, they're just barriers that are preventing us from achieving this new world. Now this brings me to the topic, we'll be talking about accelerating change, especially in this latter part of the 20th century. And in fact, was one of the impetus for the field of future studies to emerge, really had to do with the fact of accelerating change, where businesses, corporations wanted to be able to survive because there was a faster rate of rise and fall of corporations. So this future studies, or foresight studies, was seen as one way to help in that struggle for survival. Alvin Toffler, in the 1970s, put out a book called Future Shock, and he talks about how this accelerating change has had a huge impact on society, on our consciousness, to the extent that we just can't seem to keep up with it. We get overwhelmed with it, can't adapt to it. So we live within an unsurpassed technological and informational explosion. It's coupled with a social reality of increased transience and turnover in products, friends, spouses, neighborhoods, and vocations. And media, government, business, pop culture, they all play up the role of the importance and value of change. But at the same time, this acceleration of change has brought about an era of stress and overload. Since the world around us is changing faster than humans can psychologically, physically, and culturally keep up with. So it's just overwhelming. It's called future shock. And you can see in the graph, for example, there are many graphs like this, indicating this kind of exponential change that has just exploded since the latter half of the 20th century. And how this all interacts and what it's going to, what kind of impact it's going to have in the 21st century is something that we have to consider. So, related to future shock is, in the acceleration of change, is that the idea of hyperculture and the death of the future. So, as we try to squeeze more information, tasks, activities, experiences into the now, we pay less attention to the past and the future. Our attention span shrinks to ever smaller, more compressed units of time, jumping quickly from one thing to the next, continuously distracted, immersed in the buzz of the moment. So, living in such a maniacal reality, we collectively suffer from a lack of sustained focus. It's a kind of social attention deficit disorder. So, and we lose our sense of history as well. And when we do that, we suffer from cultural amnesia. And as we lose our sense of history, we also lose our sense of the future. So we become trapped in this overpowering present that's cut off from both past and future. And one of the reasons for this, at least has played a great role, I would say, is that of the media. And so I want to look at the role of media as spectacle, which was first coined by Guy Debord, the French social theorist, that media spectacle, the globalization of spectacle, as images, the ability of media or spectacle to produce consumer culture. Again, this is related to the growth of world capitalism, the consumer culture, where consumption ethic is emphasized as one of the key components, really, of capitalism. That is, of production, distribution, and consumption. So consumption has to be maintained largely through advertising, and advertising is carried out by media. And it has been the case on a global scale, which increases in its sophistication and ubiquity of media spectacles to such an extent that it becomes difficult to distinguish what the spectacle is referring to from the spectacle itself. So TV news, like entertainment, focuses on the spectacular visual rather than the important news events of the day. Unless a significant visual is presented, little or no TV time is granted. The dominance of spectacle. And then you could have trivial news. It really has nothing to do with our lives. In substance, I mean, it's more fantasy than anything else. And it gets lots of TV coverage. And the reason is because whatever the event may be, there's the ability to have effective, powerful visuals are associated with it. If that's the case, and that's what gets played and over again, because that's what makes money. That's what's is financially beneficial to the media organizations and the companies that they support, their interests. The focus on media spectacle emphasizes the global power of mainstream media, MSM. Now, on the other hand, via the internet, due to the digital revolution, counter-hegemonic narratives have come about within the last, mostly in the 21st century, I'd say. And they have emerged to counter this dominant narrative of the mainstream media. And they represent marginalized voices that have mostly been suppressed, stifled, censored. They rise to challenge these dominant narratives. The neoliberal world order, for example. And so we have a world of differences now that circulate globally to serve as a counterweight to the global power of MSM. And I think this is a good thing. I mean, thank God for the internet, but again, it's a reason why the internet needs to be kept free and independent, because if the internet is and as the trend has been, the large monopolies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, and so on, they are able to dominate the medium, and then they can start to suppress, and there's evidence that they have start to suppress, censor these counter-hegemonic narratives that challenge them. So that's something to be aware of. Well, I want to turn now to another reaction to the acceleration of change, and which is made by the heartlanders, the more traditional conservative voices, who say, wait a minute, and are also overwhelmed by future shock. And they say, well, hold on a second, we're past our prime and we've lost our way. And this change, a lot of this change is not good because it's threatening our traditional values, and we're losing our identity. So they advocate a return to more simpler times. Maybe it's been romanticized a bit, but anyway, when hierarchical social relations were clearer, technology was less disruptive even within the family unit, for example. How media and sort of digital technology is really causes a lot of problems within families being able to communicate with each other. So the Heartlanders, they want to return to a time when change was not so disruptive, not so overwhelming. You have to realize that for the better part of human history, there was very little change, social change, from one generation to the next. And it's only with the advent of modernity that change became a motive, that societies and culture began to change. And this is accelerated, this process is accelerated especially in the latter half of the 20th century due to, again, innovations, technological innovations, where people can communicate and can travel more easily. And to the extent, as I mentioned earlier, that it becomes enter into a state of future shock. And so this is what the Heartlanders are reacting to. They fear the unpredictability of the future, and this is sort of uncontrollable change. They want to return to an idealized, supposedly better way of life in the past. And actually, there are two different kinds of Heartlanders. There's the non-Western Heartlanders. These are the indigenous cultures that have been reacting to the threats that globalization has brought to their traditions, to their values, and their way of life. They find this being greatly, the society's being upended, and they lament how their children are becoming more and more westernized. And so, on the other hand, you have the U.S. traditionalists who are mostly conservatives, patriotic, pro-American. And then, on the other hand, outside the U.S., the traditionalists tend to be anti-American, who see the U.S. more as an empire, really, a global empire, that's hegemonic and is infringing upon their traditional cultural values. And so they're, to some extent, we can say that, I mean, for example, the Islamic fundamentalists, are to a large degree are a reaction to this phenomena, who want to preserve traditional values of Islamic culture. So, so even though the Heartlanders are kind of, want to return to the past, but at the same time they want to preserve their traditions and their values and customs in the future. So, this brings me to another area that I would like to, I think is important. An important work in the 20th century, definitely a classic text in future studies, is The Limits to Growth. It came out in 1972. And actually, in the beginning, it began in 1970 with an international team of researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who were studying the implications of continued worldwide economic growth. And they were, at the same time, they were funded by the Club of Rome, and to do this study that was at that time, computer technology was just starting to come into its own, and so it had an impact on forecasting methods, and so this was a computer model for World 3, called it, and it examined 5 basic factors and their interactions, which then would determine and ultimately limit growth on the planet. And these factors were population increase, agricultural production, non-renewable resource depletion, industrial output, and pollution generation. So they fed the data of these 5 factors into the global computer model, and then tested the behavior of the model under several sets of assumptions to determine the alternative patterns for humankind's future. And mostly the time frame was 50 to 100 years. So, that being 1970, and here we are 2020, it's 50 years later. So it's important to look at this and see how it measures up to we're now entering into the period that they were forecasting. And the conclusion that was reached is that interlocking planetary resources, nature's system in the biosphere, cannot support the rate of economic and population growth in the latter half of the 21st century, even with advanced technological innovations. So, in other words, they did not deny that technological innovations could have an impact and could, prolong growth, but it would not. It would not change the physical reality of the limits to growth, just based on these interactions between these five factors, if their trends continue in the future. Pollution and resource scarcity would start to impact production, and then food would be impacted. Well, this is a controversial conclusion, and it got a lot of criticism as a result. And there were perhaps some mistakes that were made, which those who produced the study acknowledged, and they've updated it ever since. But the main thesis, the main trajectory overall still remains pretty accurate. Still remains valid. And well, this is, so now we're living in this time, and it's important to understand because, basically what limits to growth projected was their forecast was that of overshoot and collapse. And collapse meaning the collapse of industrial civilization. And again, they didn't say this had to happen. They weren't predicting the future. They were saying that this is what will happen if we don't do anything, if we just continue with business as usual. But if we recognize, this trajectory, and we begin to make changes in our way of life, then we can avert this future, and we can make a transition to a more sustainable path. But of course, we didn't do that. In the last 50 years, we pretty much ignored the limits to growth, and now it's the windows of opportunity are narrower than they were back then, because to make this kind of transition, it requires infrastructure, and infrastructure just doesn't happen overnight. It takes decades or so but it needs to be invested in to make a dramatic transition to a different, economic system, made post-capitalist, for example. Well, anyway, it's an important study, limits to growth, and it's another, I think, a valuable addition to one of the, to the poles of the future. And this leads to another, kind of related, the collapse of industrial civilization, because that's what limits to growth was essentially saying, overshoot and collapse. Now, how we look at collapse, I think, there are different perspectives on that. The Roman Empire collapsed, but it didn't collapse in one day. It took several centuries. It was a process. And I don't think this is going to take several centuries, because we're dealing with in the era of accelerated change. So just as change was accelerated, the collapse will probably be accelerated too. But at the same time, it's not going to happen overnight either. Probably we're looking at the course of the 21st century, several decades. I would think that probably by the end of the 21st century we'll be ensconced, if we make it. It is, if we don't follow this sort of, you can say, doomsday scenario, this dystopic pull of the future, where, then if we make it through, in other words, we can, it's possible, then we will be in a completely different era in the future. There will be post-capitalist, post-carbon, and sustainable, global sustainability. But in this scenario here, especially also it's based on peak oil, which I don't think limits to growth really mentioned that much then. There wasn't a whole lot known about peak oil, although what Hubert's curve was known. I mean, peak, back in the 1950s, the one of the Hubert predicted that there would be a peak oil in the U.S. and now this is something I don't want to spend a lot of time right now talking about peak oil, and it's something I'll do in another presentation in the future. But it's the idea that there's again, it's based on, but it is based on limits to growth. It's based on limits of resources. There's only so much resources there. There's only so much oil in the ground. We live on a finite planet, and eventually oil will become more and more difficult to extract, and it just won't even be profitable. I mean, it's not that it'll run out, but it just won't be profitable anymore, because it'd be so hard to extract. Well, we're already in that period now. I mean, we talk about shale oil and fracking and all that. That's kind of an indication of peak oil. And when you get that desperate and you have to invest so many billions of dollars to try to extract this oil, it's not even, and then it requires so much more investment to be refined, and at the same time causes so much environmental damage in the process. It's just hardly worth it, So anyway, the idea of the collapse of industrial civilization could bring about, again, one of the impacts, and we find this to be the case in terms of ruling power globally, globalization of ruling power, and it seems to be that the world is becoming more. There's this trend of where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, world inequality. And they made some. I'm not saying that we haven't made some progress in the past, but still, this is a huge problem today. Still, when half the world only makes $2 a day and works 12 hours a day, maybe if they're lucky to get one day or half a day off a month. It's practically slave labor, and this is like a huge percentage of the population globally, and it gets worse. You can see, and especially as like today, if the pandemic has shown, we can see a destabilization in nations, and this could lead to either tyranny or anarchy. And then you can see it in the rise of religious and ideological fundamentalism, perpetual war, which basically the war on terror. I mean, it has been a perpetual war, and so. But the two critical factors, I think, besides pandemics, and we're seeing that already. That was predicted years ago, that the idea of a pandemic that could really have an impact on globally destabilizing the countries, and but other than that, I mean, there's also two huge areas that we have to be concerned about, because they do pose a great threat to the survival of humanity, and I called them in one of papers that I published called World on Fire, referred to the two kinds of fires, a fast-burning fire and the slow-burning fire. And the fast-burning fire is that of nuclear war, which could, if it were to break out, and because the systems are so automated now, it could happen within a period of even 30 minutes, half an hour, and the world could be destroyed by nuclear weapons. And this is something that really has been neglected, because people are under this idea that because of the end of the Cold War, that nuclear war is no longer thinkable. It's not true at all. If anything, at least during the Cold War, there was much more attention paid to control the nuclear weapons and the spread of nuclear technology. But now we're almost in a state of nuclear anarchy. Especially recently, the Trump administration has dismantled some of the frameworks for nuclear control. So he's shredded them. It's almost there seems to be no framework anymore for even cooperating with among nuclear powers, and this is not something that we want to see happen. But it's it is. I mean, this is. I have no words to explain really. I mean, the nightmare scenario of nuclear war. It's just beyond, I mean, I could go on and on, but it's just beyond our imagination to even try to think about what that kind of future would be. If not the extinction of humanity, the quality of life would be so compromised that maybe just a remnant of humans would be have to survive, and there'd be so much problems, with mutation, and probably the evolution would come to a standstill, and you'd probably even see devolution, where so over a long period of time humanity might survive, but it would be under such horrible environmental nuclear winter. So well, that's the hot fire, but there is another threat that I think has had a lot more play these days, although not a lot has been done to address it, but that's that of global climate change. That is the slow burning fire that eventually we could be like the frog in a pot, where it's slowly heating up, and you don't even recognize it, and then finally when it gets so hot it's too late, you can't get out. There's the danger of runaway climate change, and we don't even know really what we're experimenting with. We don't know, I mean, what the effect is. No one really knows what kind of destabilization that can cause in terms of our atmosphere, but we're starting to experience it already, with the melting of the ice caps, for example. So, well, there's a lot more to be said about global climate change, and I will, be talking about this topic in the future in another presentation. But right now, anyway, that's part of the one of the darker pull of the future, that of the collapse of industrial civilization. Now, and once again, I want to say that collapse, maybe it's not the right word, because it gives the idea that everything just, falls apart all at once, and it might not necessarily, happen that way. It won't probably happen that way. It'll take over a period of time, several decades, and I would like to refer to it more like pathways of descent, where we descend from the high peak of civilization, and then and beyond that, maybe we can talk about pathways of ascent, where again we begin to find ourselves in a different era, like I said, post-capitalist, post-carbon era that's focused on global sustainability, and that's really the rosy scenario, actually. Well, I mean, it means a whole new, different way of life, and maybe it would be a more spiritual civilization rather than materialist, so materialistically oriented and consumer culture. But maybe, they will have a different values, and will take more care to, achieve the right balance with the planet. Anyway, that's another pull of the future that I'll get to in a minute. So first of all, let me turn now to another pull of the future that I think, as I mentioned before, is significant, but it just doesn't get a whole lot of play, and that is the social-Darwinist image of the future. It has had a pull. It began in the late 19th century to describe the idea that humans, like animals and plants, compete in a struggle for existence in which natural selection results in a survival of the fittest. And but this idea has been applied not only to nature, but to society. So in the idea that those who, and to some extent there's some branches of Christianity that have, like the more Calvinist views of Protestant Christianity, that believes that those who are successful, wealthy, in other words, materialistically speaking, are those who are blessed by God. And the same thing, and so the social Darwinists argue that that's why the government should not interfere with human competition, within the capitalist system, because they shouldn't regulate the economy, or even try to cure social ills such as poverty, because this is all part of nature, of the survival for the fittest, and that those who survive, those who do better, who are those who are deserve to benefit and are the strongest of the species, so to speak, and that's what we want to carry forward into the future. So they advocate a sort of laissez-faire political, economic system that favors competition and self-interest in social and business affairs. Social Darwinists, though, will typically deny that they're social Darwinists because it's not politically correct to admit that. And they will deny that they advocate the law of the jungle. But most do propose arguments that do justify, one way or the other, imbalances of power between individuals, races, and nations, because they consider some people more fit to survive than others. So, and we find this is also very class-based, and those who are in the, many, not all, but a lot in the upper classes of society believe that, they are the fittest to survive, and that maybe for example, there's a problem with population. The population is the biggest problem in the world today, and it's better. The planet really can only support, let's say, 2 billion people, and while those other people of the lower end, they're the problems, and it's better if even if 80% of the population were to die off, that would actually be better. We'd have a better living arrangement on the planet, and we could live in balance with nature. It's just that there's too many people, and so it's better if those people just die off one way or the other. So well, that's the sort of logic. I'm just telling you what the logic is, behind some of the social Darwinists, even if they don't admit that they're social Darwinists. Now, another pole of the future is one that has been put forth by the great historian Arnold Toynbee, whose philosophy of history has had also, I think, has had a great impact in the future studies field, especially on the sociologist Frederick Pollock, who wrote about the image of the future, and he derived a lot of his analysis was derived from Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee wrote about this, said that the rise and fall of civilizations, that one of the key factors for survival of a civilization is that of a creative minority. So who are the creative minority? They are those, they're not necessarily the elite, they're not, within a society who have the most power, but they are the creative people, the visionaries, the philosophers, artists too, who challenge the used future. And instead of imitating what everybody else does, they innovate. Steep, social, technological, environmental, economic, or political, or maybe cultural or spiritual innovations. They are the change agents who imagine a different future, and they inspire others to work toward it. So, as Toynbee said, on this showing, the nature of the breakdown of civilizations can be summed up in 3 points. This is why civilizations break down. It's 3 main reasons. It's a pattern throughout human history. It's 1, a failure of the creative power in the minority. And when this happens, then you have an answering withdrawal of mimesis on part of the majority. They no longer have effective leadership. And as a result, then you have a loss of social unity. It becomes fractured, the society does. And this is where the breakdown occurs. He says there's hinge periods in human history when the actions of a few can make a dramatic difference. And it's in these periods, especially, that the old ways of behavior are no longer helpful. Doing what you used to do, the used future, doesn't work anymore. You know. So, and we're most likely in this phase now. I mean, there's a number of indicators to suggest that. Conclusion. We're in a transitional phase where what used to be the old normal, it's not going to happen. We're not going to go back to the old normal. You know, living in a post-normal era. A new normal will emerge from that. So, and creative minority play an important role. Because without a creative minority, instead of a sustainable system, empires, 5,000 years of empires, it's about time to end the age of empires. Let's let the American empire be the last empire. We don't need a Chinese empire. We don't need any other empire. We need to come together as a world in a post-empire era. So, you know, but, you know, without a creative minority, you know, empires or world states where power and bureaucracy dominate will go unchallenged. And they will only grow larger and become more dystopic. And in these dystopias, charisma becomes routinized by demagogues who proclaim that they have the answer when they really don't. And because the people are feeling in such a state of despair, they're willing to follow these demagogues. You know, this will happen, especially in democracy, you know, where when democracy is failing, I should say. So the hunger for alternatives in this dystopia where the creative minority have failed to meet human needs, it begins to drift away. And it's replaced by passive acquiescence. And as size and growth takes precedence, at the same time, when you focus on the quantitative at the expense of the qualitative, then inner development or spiritual development disappears. And people, for the most part, become sort of nihilistic. Their outlook on life in general. Social Darwinism is not the answer. It's not the way forward. And this ideology needs to be exposed, you know, for what it is. It is at the root of the solidification of class consciousness, and it's a justification for oppression of those who are less privileged, those who are the losers, you know, those who, you know, in the struggle for survival. This is just unacceptable. We have to realize, I think, in order to survive as a species, that we are all in the same boat, not worlds apart. So we have to move then towards a new awakening of a conscious evolution. As H.G. Wells, in fact, said in much of his writings, that the cooperative element of Darwin's theory is something that, for the survival of the species, is something that we need to address more, and we need to focus on more. So evolution may be now moving from randomness, unconscious evolution, to a conscious, visionary direction. Because in the past, we were largely unaware of evolution. But now that we are become more and more aware of evolution, we realize that we have a choice, that we can direct evolution, our own evolution. You know, and this is not only conscious evolution, but the evolution of consciousness. Working together is a sort of dynamic way of transforming what it means to be human. We can no longer just keep pushing crisis back, focusing only on spectacle and surface reality, instead of resolving these deeper issues. And again, knowing what it means to be human. and which means that we don't accept social Darwinism. We accept that we are, we have unlimited potential. So man over nature may have brought technological progress, but now, this view is threatening to extinguish us all. So many of the assumptions that we had in the past, we have to review those again. So conscious evolution is a new vision of the future. We can instead we can look upon a new paradigm where the planet is our garden, which we must cultivate for the benefit of all. Restore the earth and the world. Repair the damage caused to nature, the environment, ourselves, and to each other. Establish and pursue well-being with mindful, spiritual values as our common heritage and the way to happiness rather than the materialist, mindless consumerism. Realize the interconnected, harmonious synergy between women, men, humans, nature, and humans and technology. In other words, it doesn't mean we have to completely get rid of technology. Technology can be a great tool in our path, to transform ourselves in the 21st century. But it must be appropriate technology, where humans are the master, not technology. Technology serves us rather than we serving technology. So we have to discover, though, what it means to be human, our true identity, and what is our common path on this planet. And that brings me to the conclusion, which is the Great Awakening. Once we begin to understand the implications of conscious evolution, we can come to a great awakening about who we are and what it means to be human, and how we can make it in this century, in the 21st century, in the great transition. In the era of globalization, the domination of multinational corporations and Pax Americana and its military-industrial complex, the nation state became weakened, and so the United Nations has become ineffective. So what's needed is a more effective, just, fair, global governance system. This is critical to global futures. So you have to recognize that much of what worked or didn't work in the 20th century is no longer going to be of assistance in the 21st century. So the 21st century mind must throw off the shackles of the 20th century mind and emerge to restore the planet, create new economic and social relations, stop war, address global climate change, and realize a new era and world. Humankind needs a 21st century vision of the future, one that is based on sustainable and adaptable development. The whole new meaning of development or progress. We don't necessarily have to dispense with the idea of progress, but we have to reconceptualize what that means in terms of what it means to be human. Our existence as a people, as one race on this planet. The key is conscious evolution, guided by the creative minority, as Toynbee said, which I think does play a key role in the survival of civilizations and the emergence of the 21st century mind. That's the key that can unlock a brighter future for all of humanity. Thank you.